The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the dried grass of the Johnson ranch, and Thomas Johnson stood there with his worn hat pushed back on his head, watching something he never expected to see in all his 62 years of living. Woman sat tied between two fence posts, her arms stretched wide and bound with thick rope, and she wasn't struggling anymore, like she might have been hours before when whoever left her there had ridden away. Thomas had been checking the eastern fence, line like he did every Sunday after church when he spotted her from half a mile off. And at first he thought it might be a trick of the light, or maybe some old tarp caught between the posts. But as he rode closer on his mare, Della, he could see, it was a person, and his heart started beating harder in his chest. The woman's head hung forward and her dark hair fell across her face, and Thomas could see the dust and dirt on her clothes and the red marks on her skin where the rope had been, too tight for too long. He stopped Della about 20 feet away and just sat there in the saddle for a long moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing and trying to figure out if this was some kind of ambush, because you didn't live as long as Thomas had in this country without learning to be careful. But there was nobody else around, just the woman and the fence posts and the endless prairie grass bending in the warm breeze. Thomas climbed down from Della slow and careful, and his knees protested a little like they always did these days, and he walked closer until he was standing just a few feet from where she sat. "Ma'am," he said, quiet and gentle, like he was talking to a spooked horse. She lifted her head then, and her eyes were red from crying and her face was streaked with tears and dust mixed together, and she looked at him with an expression Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't hope exactly, and it wasn't fear either, but something in between. Something, resigned and tired and so very human. "I beg you," she said, and her voice cracked from thirst. "Just make it quick." Thomas felt something twist inside his chest, and he took off his hat and held it against his stomach, and he looked at this woman who thought he was going to hurt her, who thought he was going to finish whatever terrible thing had been started. "Ma'am," he said again, and he kept his voice as soft as Sunday morning. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't seem to believe him, and maybe she couldn't after whatever had brought her to this place tied up under the hot sun, and Thomas understood that too, because trust was a fragile thing, and easily broken. He moved, slowly reaching for the knife he kept on his belt, and she flinched when she saw it and closed her eyes tight like she was bracing for pain. "I'm just going to cut these ropes," Thomas said. "That's all I'm going to do." He knelt down beside her and his old knees creaked again, and he started sawing at the thick rope that bound her left wrist to the fence post, and it took longer than he expected, because the rope was new and strong, and whoever had tied her there had meant for her to stay. When the first rope finally gave way, her arm dropped and she gasped, and Thomas could see the deep grooves in her wrist where the rope had bitten into her skin. He moved to the other side and started working on the second rope, and neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the knife working through the fibers and Della snorting softly behind them and the wind moving through the grass. When both ropes were cut, the woman slumped forward and Thomas caught her by the shoulders to keep her from falling face first into the dirt. "Easy now," he said. "You've been tied up a long time and your body needs a minute to remember how to work." She was crying again, but quietly, and Thomas helped her sit up straighter, and he pulled his canteen from his belt and uncapped it and held it to her lips. "Slow sips," he said. "Not too much at once or you'll just bring it back up." She drank and some of the water spilled down her chin and onto her torn dress, but most of it went where it was supposed to go, and after a few sips she pulled back and took a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas capped the canteen and sat back on his heels and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and he could see she was maybe 35 or 40, and had probably been real pretty before whatever happened to her happened. "My name's Thomas Johnson," he said. "This is my land you're on, and that's my house about 3 miles west, and I think you should come back there with me so my wife Margaret can tend to those rope burns and get you cleaned up and fed." The woman's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Why?" she said. "Why would you help me?" Thomas thought about that question and all the ways he could answer it, and he thought about his own daughter, Sarah, who was grown now and living in Kansas City with her husband and their 3 children. And he thought about all the times in his life when someone had shown him kindness when they didn't have to. Because it's the right thing to do, he said, finally, and because nobody deserves to be left tied up to die in the sun. He stood up and his knees protested again, and he held out his hand to her, and after a moment she took it, and he helped her to her feet and she swayed a little but stayed. Upright, can you ride? Thomas asked. I think so, she said. He helped her up onto Della and then climbed up behind her and turned the mare toward home, and they rode slow and steady across the prairie while the sun sank lower in the west. Margaret was hanging laundry behind the house when they rode up, and she took one look at the woman sitting in front of Thomas and dropped the sheet she was holding and came running. Thomas Johnson. What on earth? She said. Found her tied up at the east fence, Thomas said, climbing down and then helping the woman down. She needs tending to. Margaret didn't ask any more questions right then, and Thomas loved her for that among many other things, and she put her arm around the woman and led her toward the house, talking soft and gentle the whole way. Thomas took care of Della and gave her an extra measure of oats because she'd been patient and good, and then he went inside and found Margaret in the kitchen, heating water. And the woman was sitting at the table with a blanket around her shoulders. Her name's Elizabeth. Margaret said Elizabeth Carson. Thomas nodded and sat down across from Elizabeth, and Margaret brought them both coffee and some leftover cornbread from breakfast. You don't have to tell us what happened, Thomas said, unless you want to. Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and stared into it for a long time, and Thomas and Margaret waited and didn't push. My husband, she said finally. He caught me reading a letter from my sister, and he decided I was being unfaithful to him even though I wasn't, and he never was quite right in the head about things like that, and he tied me up and took me out there and said if I was going to act like a harlot, then I could die like one. Margaret made a soft sound and reached across the table to cover Elizabeth's hand with her own. That's his horse tied up back there, Elizabeth said. He just left me and rode off on the other one, and I thought I was going to die out there, and then I saw you coming and I thought you were him. Come back to finish it. You're safe now, Margaret said firm and clear. You're safe here and you can stay as long as you need to. Elizabeth started crying again, and Margaret moved her chair closer and put her arms around her, and Thomas got up and went outside to give them some privacy. He stood on the porch and looked out at the land he'd worked for 40 years, and thought about all the cruelty in the world, and all the kindness, too, and how sometimes you got to choose which one you added to. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth stayed with them, and Margaret tended to her rope burns until they healed and fed her until the hollow look left her face, and Thomas gave her small jobs around the ranch that made her feel useful instead of just helped. She was good with the chickens and even better with the garden, and sometimes in the evenings the three of them would sit on the porch and watch the sunset and talk about small things like weather and crops and nothing that hurt too much. One morning, about a month after Thomas had found her, Elizabeth came down to breakfast with her bag packed. I can't stay forever, she said, as much as I'd like to, and my sister wrote back and said I can come live with her in Denver, and she sent money for the train. Margaret hugged her tight and Thomas shook her hand and tried not to notice that his eyes were a little damp. You write to us, Margaret said. You let us know you're all right. I will, Elizabeth promised. And thank you both for showing me that there's still good people in this world. Thomas drove her to town in the wagon and waited with her at the station until the train came, and when it was time to say goodbye, Elizabeth hugged him and he patted her back awkwardly because he'd never been good at that sort of thing. That day, she said, pulling back to look at him, when you found me and I asked you to make it quick and you didn't, and you helped me instead. That changed everything for me, and I want you to know that. You'd have done the same, Thomas said. I hope I would have. She said, I hope I will if I ever get the chance. The train whistle blew and she picked up her bag and climbed aboard, and Thomas stood on the platform and watched until the train was just a speck in the distance. He drove home slow and thought about second chances and how life was long and full of moments where you chose what kind of person you were going to be. Margaret was waiting on the porch when he got home, and she had 2 glasses of lemonade, and they sat together in the rocking chairs they'd bought 20 years ago, when Thomas's back had started hurting. You did a good thing, Margaret,